It is a well-known fact that the world has witnessed two devastating global wars that not only claimed millions of lives but also caused unimaginable destruction across many nations. But have you ever wondered how the First World War actually began? What circumstances turned a regional conflict into a massive global war that completely changed the political map of the world? In today's video, we will explore the real reasons behind the beginning of World War I and understand how a single event eventually dragged almost the entire world into chaos. Before the outbreak of World War I, around the early 1900s, the situation in Europe appeared relatively stable. Western and European nations were rapidly advancing in science, technology, industry, and military development. During this period, many new inventions and modern war machines were introduced, making armies more powerful than ever before. At the same time, several important political agreements and military alliances were signed between countries. According to these agreements, if one nation was attacked by an enemy, its allied nations would come forward to support and defend it during war. Meanwhile, countries like Germany and Britain were heavily expanding their military strength. Tensions between these nations were already growing due to territorial disputes and competition for dominance in Europe. Slowly, powerful nations began forming separate groups and alliances. Their goal was to expand influence, dominate global trade routes, and gain control over valuable resources from weaker nations. Larger countries were trying to pull smaller nations into their camps so they could emerge as global superpowers. Because of this growing competition, conflict between major powers became almost unavoidable. In many ways, the race to become the most powerful empire in the world became one of the biggest reasons behind the First World War. Numerous countries, both large and small, were eventually drawn into this conflict and suffered severe consequences. By this time, the world had largely divided into two major groups. The first group was known as the Allied Powers, which mainly included Russia, France, Britain, United States, Japan. The second group was called the Central Powers, which included Germany, Ottoman Empire, Austria-Hungary. Although wars are usually caused by multiple reasons, military expansion was considered one of the most important causes of World War I. During that era, powerful countries often invaded weaker nations and occupied their territories. After capturing those lands, they exploited local resources and controlled the lives of the people living there. Over time, many nations realized that the only way to protect themselves from foreign invasions was to build stronger armies. As a result, countries began rapidly increasing the size of their military forces. Scientists and engineers started developing advanced weapons, artillery systems, battleships, and military technology capable of destroying enemy armies within minutes. The stronger a nation's military became, the more fear it created among rival nations. Eventually, the situation reached a point where countries started cooperating with one another to prevent any single nation from becoming too powerful. This led to the signing of military treaties and alliances. According to these agreements, allied nations were expected to support each other during wartime by sending troops and military assistance against enemy forces. At the same time, many countries were spending almost 80% of their economic resources on weapons and military development. This naturally increased poverty, inflation, and public dissatisfaction within several nations. Prices of food and essential goods also began rising internationally. Another major factor behind the war was imperialism. Powerful nations wanted to expand their empires by controlling weaker territories and turning them into colonies. During this period, Africa remained one of the few regions where European powers were still competing aggressively for influence and control. Soon, a race began among European countries to dominate Africa. Eventually, Britain succeeded in establishing a strong colonial presence there. Around the same time, valuable diamond mines were discovered in Africa, attracting even more attention from global powers. Countries wanted control over these resources because they promised enormous economic benefits. Before the First World War began, Britain controlled a large portion of the world, and even India was under British colonial rule at that time. Britain was benefiting not only economically but also strategically, gaining access to resources and military strength from its colonies. Meanwhile, relations between Austria-Hungary and Serbia were becoming increasingly hostile, as both sides were involved in political tensions and regional disputes. Then came the event that changed everything. On June 28, 1914, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo by a man named Gavrilo Princip. The prince died on the spot after being shot. This incident enraged Austria-Hungary. The government believed that Serbia was somehow connected to the assassination. Soon after, Austria-Hungary issued a harsh ultimatum to Serbia and threatened military action if its demands were not accepted. This moment marked the beginning of World War I. As tensions escalated, Serbia sought help from Russia. Russia responded by mobilizing its military forces against Austria-Hungary and Germany. Once the war began, Allied nations quickly entered the battlefield because their treaties required them to support their partners during conflict. What started in June 1914 as a regional crisis soon turned into a worldwide war involving multiple nations. The conflict spread rapidly across land, sea, and air. Massive bombings, artillery attacks, and naval warfare caused destruction on an unprecedented scale. Every country wanted victory because winning the war meant gaining territory, resources, and political influence. In 1917, the United States officially joined the war on the side of the Allied powers. However, due to the Russian Revolution, Russia eventually withdrew from the war and signed a peace agreement. But by the time Russia exited the conflict, enormous destruction had already taken place. Countries like Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Russia had suffered massive losses. Finally, on November 11, 1918, the war officially came to an end. After 4 years of brutal fighting, many countries had exhausted their military resources and no longer had enough soldiers to continue the conflict. Once the war ended, the borders of Europe were redrawn. Since Russia had stepped back from global influence, the United States emerged as a new world power. Although America initially decided not to participate in future global wars, circumstances later forced it to enter World War II, where it eventually carried out nuclear attacks on Japan. The effects of World War I were not limited to Europe alone. Colonized regions in Africa and Asia were also deeply affected because they were controlled by powerful imperial nations. During the war, nearly 1.3 million Indian soldiers served in the British Indian Army and fought in places such as France, Iraq, and Egypt. Around 50,000 Indian soldiers lost their lives during the conflict. Their names are memorialized today on the walls of India Gate. At that time, the British Army paid Indian infantry soldiers a very small monthly salary, although promises were made to increase wages for soldiers fighting in the war. The outcome of the First World War was horrifying. Millions of soldiers and civilians lost their lives. Many women became widows after losing their husbands in battle. In several places, widows gathered and removed their wedding rings as a symbolic message showing how war had destroyed countless families. Many soldiers had been recruited directly from their homes without proper military training. As the war continued, countries like the Ottoman Empire and Austria-Hungary eventually surrendered, leaving Germany isolated. In the end, Germany was forced to accept defeat against the Allied powers. This defeat completely transformed the balance of global power. Germany officially signed agreements declaring the end of the war. Overall, more than 11 million soldiers died during World War I, while over 6 million civilians were killed. More than 20 million people were seriously injured. The war also devastated economies around the world. In the race to achieve victory, countries ignored food supplies and essential civilian needs, leading to severe global economic problems. Large areas of farmland were destroyed due to heavy bombings and explosive chemicals, making the soil infertile. Rivers and water bodies became polluted from military waste and explosives, causing widespread health issues. Diseases and epidemics spread rapidly in many regions. Countless families suffered psychological trauma and depression after the war. Even though India was not directly responsible for the conflict, it still faced serious economic consequences because Britain increased production demands from its colonies. Indian citizens were pressured to produce more goods and resources while their own food and healthcare needs were often ignored. After the war ended, new peace treaties were signed between nations. Meanwhile, the rise of America as a superpower created growing tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, tensions that later developed into the Cold War. So now you can understand how and why the First World War began, and how it caused destruction on a truly global scale. No matter what the reason behind a war may be, its consequences are always devastating. That's all for today's video. If you enjoyed this content, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more historical documentaries.